Well, hello and welcome back to the Economy Stage here at the CogX Hybrid Festival 2021. I'm Felicity Birch and I'm the CBI's Director of Innovation and Digital, and I'm emceeing this virtual Economy Stage today, where we're exploring the concept of building back better after the pandemic. We're going to start our next session in a moment, but just a reminder that you can get involved throughout. Feel free to submit questions through the session for Q&A at the end. Tweet us via @CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 and submit questions through Hopin. In this session, using the power of Anthro-Vision to understand human behaviour and drive change, Gillian Tett, anthropologist and editor-at-large at the FT, will be talking to researcher and broadcaster Stephanie Hare about how anthropology, the scientific study of human behavioural patterns and underlying meaning, has found new domains of research in business and economy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephanie and Gillian.
Hello.
Hi, great to be here virtually.
So glad to see you and meet you in person. As a long fan of your books, I've read Fool's Gold and The Silo Effect, and I spent the weekend with Anthro-Vision.
Oh, thank you.
Very fascinating book. So most people will know you, of course, as the editor-at-large at the Financial Times, but you are also Dr Tet.
I am, and I never use the word doctor anywhere apart from in Japan, where I once worked, and the Japanese, wonderful Japanese, couldn't understand why a young blonde female was in the job I was in. So I used doctor to try and give myself more credibility, but otherwise I don't use it normally.
Wow. Can you tell the audience, for those who may not know why you are Dr. Tet in your secret life?
Absolutely. Well, because I've been working at the Financial Times now for the past quarter century, and because I've written almost entirely about economics and finance and business, everyone assumes that I must have a PhD in economics or an MBA or astrophysics or something like that, because certainly for the last few decades, the degrees which commanded credibility in finance and business and policy making were the quantitative degrees usually. But I actually have a PhD in cultural anthropology, which is the branch of social science that looks at human culture. And back in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, I was based in a place called Soviet Tajikistan, just north of Afghanistan. If you visualize Afghanistan in your mind, that's kind of what Tajikistan is like. And I did a PhD there studying Tajik wedding rituals and what that revealed about Islamic identity and the then Soviet communist system.
And how did your research in Tajik wedding rituals help you go to the FT and write the brilliant Fool's Gold, which helped to explore JP Morgan and Wall Street, the sort of tribes of Wall Street? And then you went into the Silo Effect, which really looked at the dangers of groupthink and how to broaden out. And now with Anthro-Vision, you're really offering a very compelling and fascinating intellectual framework. How did that journey happen for you?
Well, thank you for asking that. And I must say, for many, many, many years, I didn't talk about my weird background because in the eyes of most grown-ups in the City of London or the business community or the policy-making world, my background was completely weird, if not, as one banker once told me famously, completely hippie as well. And what that really started to change in 2008, when the financial crisis gave everybody a wake-up call to the idea that actually algorithms and economic models cannot explain everything in life. They can explain a lot, but not everything. And people became more interested in anthropology. And I think that's really accelerated in the last few years, particularly with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I can explain why later. But, my journey from being up in the mountains of Tajikistan really happened because at the end of my research process, and if you are an anthropologist, what you do is you study human culture by basically immersing yourself into a community, or at least you did traditionally. So in my case, I lived up in the mountains, really quite remote area, and I lived, as a Tajik girl with a family in Tajikistan. I basically dressed like a Tajik girl. I spoke Tajik because no one else obviously spoke English. I looked after goats. I looked after babies. I did the household chores. I basically lived, with the family. And at the end of that period of study, there was tragically a very brutal civil war. The Soviet Union broke up, and a few months later, a civil war happened. And I originally got involved in journalism really partly out of human rights reasons and because I wanted to be a war reporter, and joined the FT because it was the only publication interested in somewhere as remote and weird as Tajikistan. And one thing led to another. And they said to me, well, we'll give you a program, a student program if you want, if you come back to head office and basically enroll in our training program, but you're going to have to learn about economics and finance. And my first reaction was, oh, God, how boring. Because, you know, I came from a background of cultural studies and really thought that what I wanted to do was be a war reporter. And the most important things to write about were small wars. So I went back to the Financial Times headquarters, originally almost on sufferance, and spent a few weeks in the economics team, and then suddenly realized this totally obvious point, which is that the way that money goes around the world is incredibly important. And if you don't understand it, then actually you don't really understand how power works in the world. And then I realized actually the people who look at how money goes around the world tend to make a crucial mistake, which is to think that the only thing that matters is money. And they don't put money into a cultural and political context. So I sort of dreamt of trying to find a way to combine the two, to look at money and finance, but to look at it in a cultural and political context, and to carve out a career as a journalist doing that. So that's really my story. And I went on, I spent many years as a reporter covering finance. Eventually, I ended up running the financial section of the FT. In the course of that, I became passionately interested in the whole world of credit derivatives, really very early on, well before most people were looking at it. And I did so very much because of my anthropology training. And then went on to cover business culture in general, Trump's America, where I ran the editorial operations for the FT in North America for a while. And also, most recently, have looked a lot at tech and Silicon Valley, again, very much with the anthropologist lens.
Which is such a fascinating introduction then into what we'll sort of dive into with your book, because you talk about some really fascinating things there. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a lot that there's been a lot of companies that have hired anthropologists, Western companies. And I wanted to ask you, are Western anthropologists studying the rest of the world as much as the rest of the world's anthropologists are studying the West? Or is it one-way traffic?
At the moment, it is more one-way traffic, and that is a profound tragedy, and I hope it changes. Anthropology emerged in the 19th century out of, frankly, the Victorian Empire or the other European empires. It initially emerged in fairly shameful conditions because the 19th century was a time when Victorian England and intellectual life was convulsed by Charles Darwin's theories about evolution. And there was a lot of interest, not just in physical evolution, which is the realm of physical anthropology, biology, bones, that kind of stuff, but also social evolution, the question of how and why different societies had evolved in a cultural sense. And on top of that, you had a number of European societies and the American societies that were trying to either justify imperialism and their colonial expansion and the slave trade, or they were trying to find ways to, frankly, control all the weird people in their eyes in their empires. And they wanted to convert them, control them, tax them, trade with them, etc. So there was a really strong interest in the 19th century in trying to understand the other, someone that seemed different from the Western European civilization. And yet that was very much imbued with a very imperialist, racist mold. What changed in the 20th century was that anthropology as a discipline did a 180-degree U-turn. And when some anthropologists stopped looking at strange other people from the comfort of their universities, their ivory tower, or the colonial bungalow, and actually went out and lived among them, they realized just how wrong-headed it was to assume that Western society was superior, or even assume there was a sort of one way to evolve. And anthropology went from being a champion of racism to being the bastion of anti-racist thought. The Nazis burnt anthropologist books and things like that. And they also went into a bastion of being anti-colonial. So today, anthropology as a discipline very strongly upholds many of the ideas found in the diversity movements, Black Lives Matter movements, LGBT, all of those. That is absolutely what anthropology upholds and champions, which is tolerance and inclusion. But unfortunately, the reality is that most anthropologists still emanate, like me, from the privileged Western world. So the traffic tends to be one way in terms of Westerners looking at non-Westerners. There are some anthropologists, brilliant anthropologists, who are now flipping the lens, and there need to be a lot more of them. And there are certainly some anthropologists flipping the lens. The last thing I'll say is that once anthropologists realized in the early 20th century that it was completely wrong to assume that the Western societies were somehow superior to non-Western, out of that realization then came another equally important intellectual step, which was that actually, if you think that all societies are valuable, then the very act of looking at another society can not just help you understand the other society, but help you flip the lens and look back at yourself. And anthropologists today look at the Western world as much, if not more, than the non-Western world, to try and understand the cultural patterns that shape anybody, whether you're in an Amazon warehouse or an Amazon jungle. We're all human, we're all creatures of our same cultural environment. And for all of us, it pays to try and understand that.
And you mentioned this with a relevance that I think our colleagues who work in artificial intelligence might find interesting, which is you talk about how anthropology studies what it means to be human. But what's interesting is I think you might be coming at it from a different question as an anthropologist than people in AI, who often are looking at this in terms of questions of consciousness and what the brain is. And I wondered if you could expand a bit on how you think anthropologists might help people working in artificial intelligence to answer this question of what it means to be human.
Well, I think there are three ways that it really pays for people working in the field of AI to think about what I call the second AI, anthropology intelligence or anthro-intelligence. The first and most obvious, in fact, four ways. The first and most obvious is that anthropology stresses that if you're going to look at anything, you need to look at context. And looking at the context of the people who are creating AI today and the degree to which they are or are not representative of the type of thing that the AI models are trying to capture is crucial. And I know, to its credit, people in the AI industry have been waking up to this point about bias amongst AI creators and researchers, but that needs to be developed much more. Secondly, because anthropology stresses context, the question of how AI is used and the social context of that and the ethical context and how that's changing is another area where actually anthropology can add a lot to the discussion. And I should stress there are people, amazing people, who are looking at these issues. There's a whole new up and coming world of digital anthropology, championed by groups like Data and Society in New York and others. And some tech companies are actually hiring anthropologists or using them to do this. I describe in my book how Intel has used anthropologists to look at different attitudes towards, say, facial recognition and differences between China and America and how that's evolving in a very useful way and very, very essential and critical way. There's a woman called Genevieve Bell who used to work at Intel who has an amazing research program in Australia, and she's working with the Australian government and others to look at these issues in a very interdisciplinary way that's very exciting. But there's two other areas where the second AI can help the first AI, if you like. One is a general sense that something I passionately believe is that in the late 20th century, we created a lot of amazingly good tools to make sense of the world with, to navigate with, like big data programs, like economic models, like corporate balance sheets, all of which are really useful. But they all suffer from a potential flaw, which is that they are bounded by a decision of what inputs to put into that model. And things outside are either ignored or just dismissed as externalities. And there's nothing wrong with that, because you have to have a model and tool defined by inputs, and they can be useful. But you have to also remain aware of context of what's not in your model. And anthropology's value, one of anthropology's values, is they can be an intellectual check and balance and make you think about what's outside the model. So the image I use is of a man or woman walking through a dark wood at night with a compass. And if you're walking in pitch blackness, you don't want to throw away your compass because it's useful. But if you walk through a wood and just look down at your compass all the time, you're probably going to trip over a tree root or bang into a tree. You need to raise your eyes and look around. And that's kind of what anthropology does. It enables you to look up and around and see context. And the last point I'd make from all this is that the other area that anthropology can help is that insofar as AI is doing a brilliant job of trying to track patterns of culture, consciousness, interaction, it does that often well by observing, but correlation is not the same as causation. And one of the amazing things that makes us human is the fact that our culture patterns that we absorb from our surroundings are they're not static, they're ever evolving, which is a good thing, by the way, but they're also multi-layered and often very contradictory. And to understand this, and this is a point that anyone working in AI will understand, just think about jokes. What makes a joke funny? Well, a joke's fascinating, or humor, because every time someone tells a joke, you sort of create and define and reinforce a sense of community, because you have to have a shared cultural awareness to understand a joke. Mm-hmm. And if you get the joke, you're part of the in-group. If you don't, you're part of the out-group. So there's kind of social boundaries and patterns being created, which again, machines may or may not be able to reflect and capture. But also a joke works by playing off the multi-layered contradictory natures of culture. And I would question, and maybe someone who works in AI can tell me, but I would question whether AI platforms can get that or generate that kind of contradictory, playful element. I understand that people have tried to create jokes with AI, but the fact that they're not very good for the most part indicates why AI needs a second type of AI.
I love that. And rather than asking, can machines think, it's can they be funny?
Yeah, that is the key issue, because machines can do logical processing. They can do what we aspire our brains to do, which is basically to be rational, reasonable, logical. But I don't know, and I think I want my next book to be about a journey into AI. I don't know whether anyone's managed to find an AI platform that can tell a good joke.
That is a great question for this CogX audience. If anyone knows, it'll be this crew. I want to move us to something slightly more serious, and I'm being a bit mischievous because we have another talk that's happening later today on whether or not it's possible to do ethical research or ethics research into ethics, such as ethics of AI, for instance, in a corporate environment. And you touch on some really interesting experiences of anthropologists questioning the ethics of working with the military, ethics of working with corporates. And I'm wondering if you think that anthropologists have anything to add and contribute to people who are having the AI ethics debate.
Absolutely. And this is an area which is incredibly controversial inside the anthropology community. And I fully expect that some people who are working in the academic sphere will be upset by parts of my book. Because there's a large proportion of people in the academic anthropology community who are so, it's not the only reason, but the first point one, they're deeply ashamed, understandably, of the unpleasant origins of anthropology in the 19th century, as everyone is. And they want to distance themselves from it. Good, we all do. Secondly, they think it's completely wrong for anthropologists to work for a power structure or uphold a power structure in any way, whether that's working for a military group, whether that's working for, in some cases, the government. Some people would say anthropologists shouldn't even work for government, or whether it's working for a company. And some anthropologists would say that actually working for a company like Intel is selling out everything that anthropology should stand for, because actually they should be not helping companies make more money or work out how to sell more products to consumers. For what it's worth, I am probably more of a realist in the sense that I actually think there is a role for anthropology in companies. I also think there's absolutely a role for anthropology in government policy setting. The military issue is obviously a lot more controversial. And I won't even begin to go into that one because that's a long conversation. But I do think there's a role for anthropology in companies. And I think there's a role for anthropology in companies in two ways. I think that anthropologists can help companies be more mindful, or three ways. They can be more mindful of the people they're selling to with products. And there is value in Silicon Valley waking up and realizing that their customers aren't all the same as a 25-year-old bro computer programmer sitting in a dorm somewhere in Palo Alto, that actually the mindset of people they're creating these products for is different. So that's point one, is I do think that's good. Point two is I do think that anthropologists have a lot to say about ethical and social attitudes towards the products they're creating. And that debate needs to be center stage, because I do not think that most of the people who are developing these products are particularly well placed to make these crucially important decisions about the type of products they're developing. There's an urgent need for the people who are developing this stuff to basically stop staring at the dial of their compass, look up and around, to use that wood image again. And oddly enough, actually, one of the people who said it best is Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, who, when he made his filings for an IPO last summer, said words to the effect of, well, society has outsourced the creation and development of all this software and code to a small group of geeks. He didn't use the word geek, but a small group of technocratic experts sitting in what he called a remote part of the country, i.e. Silicon Valley. And we've outsourced that to them. You know, it's not clear they want that decision or responsibility or are well equipped to do it because of this tunnel vision issue. So that's the second area where I think anthropology can really help. And the third area is simply by extension, forcing companies to flip the lens and look back at themselves. And the tragedy of what's happened so far is that Silicon Valley and the tech community have hired anthropologists to look at their customers. They've hired them and help in the UX design. They've hiring anthropologists now to look at the ethical and societal implications of the goods they're producing. Hooray, that's progress. What they have not done is what they need to do is also hire the anthropologists to flip the lens and look back at themselves and see how their own tribal patterns inside the tech companies shape how they're acting and developing their products. You know, are they diverse? What kind of unspoken cultural patterns influence how technology is developed, et cetera, et cetera. If anyone wants to look at this, I'd say start off by looking at the amazing work that Data and Society is doing in New York, or look at Microsoft deserves credit for having a really interesting pool of anthropologists working with them. People like Mary Gray, who worked with another computer scientist to look at ghost workers, is brilliant work. Look at what Genevieve's doing down in Australia. Look at some of the work that's been done looking at, say, the racial patterns in terms of different groups of coders and how that impacts the behavior of how tech is developed. There's a lot of work being done. Look at the work of Patricia Ensworth, who's looking at the use of big data and AI on Wall Street from an anthropology perspective and what that means about cybersecurity. A lot of stuff being done, but it needs to be used much, much more.
There's something that you mentioned there about something unspoken, and you talk about this in your book of listening to social silence. And that, for people, not everyone's going to become familiar with that term. What do you mean when you say you're not just listening to what people say or matching what their words are to their actions, which I think most of us can grasp and wrap our head around? It seems that what you're offering is something quite different. The silence and what isn't said. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, the way my book's structured is around what I think are the three crucial components of anthropology, which is, one, you deliberately try and immerse yourself in the minds and lives of people who seem strange to you, to get empathy from another point of view and another way of thinking. So it's basically about making what anthropologists call the strange familiar. And you do that not just to get empathy for another point of view, which, by the way, is incredibly important these days in a world which is both globalized and polarized. We need to understand each other better. But you don't just do it for that reason. You also do it because stepping out of your skin and looking back at yourself is probably the best way that you can start to see yourself clearly as well. There's this wonderful Chinese proverb, which is that a fish can't see water. And we can't see our own assumptions unless we jump out of our fishbowl. So you, looking at anthropology, you embrace culture shock to understand someone who's different from you, but you also do it to look back at yourself. And what in particular, what that perspective gives you, that sort of insider outsider perspective, making the strange familiar, the familiar strange, is the ability to pay attention not just to the parts of your world or someone else's world that everyone talks about, the areas of noise, but above all else, the areas of silence. And this is so important for big data and AI. So anthropology tries to look very hard at what people don't talk about. They try to look at the areas of the world which are like the blank spaces on the map, the parts of the world that no one actually even notices because it's either taboo or it's taken for granted, or it just seems dull and uninteresting. It falls between the cracks of our kind of mental taxonomies and classification systems, or often because in the modern world, it's wrapped up in language and jargon, which seems to be geeky and dull and boring and technocratic. I mean, today, if you want to hide something in Western society, you don't need to create a James Bond style plot or some kind of, dastardly scheme to hide something. All you have to do is wrap it up in geeky language and everyone just averts their eyes. And I say that because that's what happened with credit derivatives before 2008. It's what happened with the ad tech world before Cambridge Analytica. It's happened with cybersecurity until recently, et cetera, et cetera. So what anthropology does is anthropologists try to go into a situation and listen, not just for noise, but for silence, and to ask constantly, what are people not looking at? What are they not asking? And one of the questions I'm curious about, and I don't know the answer to because I'm not trained in AI, and I'm pretty ignorant about a lot of this field, is, to what degree can big data processes that are trained to pick up, digital signals and sort of crumbs, if you like, of activity, to what degree can they not just pick up noise, but also silence? Because that strikes me as very crucial.
It's a great question. Again, I hope that our audience will let us know, if not now, later then on Twitter. And it almost makes me think that what you're saying is, if you want to look for the next big thing, if you're looking to be ahead either for opportunities or for risks, that's the tool to use, is this listening to the silence or the thing that doesn't make sense. And I remember in Anthro-Vision, but also in Fool's Gold, you talk about this, that's how you got into your incredibly prescient call about the financial.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you, it sounds very abstract. I'll give you 3 quick examples of what I mean. One, when I was running what was called the Lex column in 2004 at the Financial Times, that's a back page commentary section, one of my editors asked me to do a kind of memo on what we should be covering on the Lex column. So I started off looking at the noise, which was basically all the articles that we already had about finance. And then I thought, well, hang on a sec, what would happen if I stopped and looked at the silence and the parts of the City of London which were expanding and they focused for a lot of activity, but not discussed in public? And what that quickly showed me was that if you looked at the City of London through that prism, the equity markets were the areas of noise because they were on the front page of the FT every day. The area of silence was this enormous shadowy sector called credit and derivatives, which no one wrote about because it seemed to be so technical and geeky and dull and boring, covered in acronyms. And I know this because I used to go to the editor on the FT and say, listen, I've got this amazing story about, some acronym, ABCDS or something like that. And they go, oh God, how boring. But talking about the noise or thinking about the noise didn't actually tell you what was really happening in the City of London. And we all woke up in 2007 and 8 and went, wow, there's a thing called credit derivatives we've been ignoring, which has basically blown up the financial system. We need to look at it. So that's one example. Another tiny example is going back to the Data and Society group in New York, amazing woman there called Dana Boyd, who used to work for Microsoft and Yahoo, who went out to do a study of teenagers' use of cell phones. And there's an issue which every single parent is probably worried about, including myself. And 99.9% of people who've gone to study this have done it by looking at the teenager and the cell phone and watching what they did with the cell phone and looking at cell phone technology. What Dana did was 101 anthropology. She went out and spent a lot of time observing networks of teenagers in the totality of their lives, and observing them, just as I observed the people in Tajikistan, the village, when I did my own research. And what she quickly realized was that cell phones were the noise everyone was talking about. The silence was what was happening in the real physical world to teenagers alongside cell phones. And the crucial point was this. If you dial back 100 years ago in American and large parts of European society, teenagers had tremendous physical freedom. They could roam, they could walk the streets, they could meet their friends, they can get on their bikes, they take a bike to work, take a bike to school, they would hang out by the bike sheds, they would collide with other people unexpected, away from parents' eyes. Today, in suburban America and parts of Europe, teenagers are tightly controlled by their parents physically, in that they're ferried around in cars, they're overscheduled, the parents are too scared of danger to let their kids just go wandering at night out on the streets. They can't roam and collide with people and explore, with tremendous freedom because of those physical controls. So cyberspace is one of the few places that they can really roam and collide with people. And you need to understand that to understand why cyberspace is so enticing as an arena for collision and exploration. It's not the only reason, but it's a silence which is really important to appreciate in order to frame the cell phone debate. But it's not a point that you can understand if you go in to study cell phones and teenagers with the preset ideas of what questions you want to ask, or most crucially, if you would go in with a big data set and just track the kind of smoke signals that teenagers are leaving in cyberspace with their cell phones, because you're not actually looking at the silence, which is the physical side. And I don't know how you'd capture that physical movement in a big data set in a way that would actually be meaningful.
No, I mean, you make a great point in defense of the importance of the human researcher and the human person interacting with other humans. And I wanted to take us away from the abstract and get us really practical so that people could take away, a tip if they don't read the book for whatever reason, which would be insane.
Please read the book. Please go buy the book. Go and buy it for all your friends and family. I have to say that I'm an author. It's
the summer beach read of 2021, I can tell you. But one thing I loved that you said that you do and that you did in your methods, and obviously we would all like to have similar success, is you talk about getting people to draw for you. And so I was drawing out my questions for this interview for your book, and you can see, I mean, it's mental, but it's a sort of schema of how I went through your book. And I wanted you to sort of share with the audience, and again, for people who are in tech who maybe don't understand why you carry around a notebook and pen or pencil even in 2021, how did that break the ice for you and get you to get people to show you their map of reality?
Yeah, it's all about diversity again, but not diversity of, racial, ethnic, age backgrounds on a team. It's about diversity of cognition and recognizing that one of the best ways to avoid having tunnel vision and being sort of too dumb is to actually have an alternative checks and balances in terms of how you look at the world. And so for that reason, I actually think a lot of people working in AI or any profession which encourages you to have tunnel vision or a certain mode of thought could benefit from this. One of the things that anthropologists do is when they go around the study community, in my case, the Tajik village, is you actually try and sketch out a geography, a map of the village, a map of people, a map of their social relations, and also a mental map of how they imagine the world. Because the way we organize space around us tends to reflect an internal set of cultural assumptions and mental maps of the world. And we reflect that when we create space. It's one reason why architects are both often very interested in anthropology, but architects are often very good at breaking silos and breaking the mold because they're trained to think about these mental maps and then try and reimagine them in quite a physical way. The person who created the MIT Media Lab was an architect, and there's that pattern quite a lot. But so basically, when you create a physical space, you reflect an existing mental map. But the sheer act of creating that physical map, of physical space, by living in it, by being embodied in it, then reproduces those cultural patterns even more strongly. And another thing that anthropologists believe is that actually, physicality matters. We don't do everything just with our heads. Embodied experience really matters. We think with our bodies as well as our brains, but in different ways. So for that reason, anthropologists spend quite a lot of time thinking about physical maps and how they can be one clue to culture. and also how and why it can help us organize our thoughts in a different way. And again, in the Western office context today, the whiteboard, the fact you get sticky Post-it notes. I'm always very struck going around tech companies in the Valley, how much they love whiteboards and their sticky brightly colored Post-it notes, and how they use that as a way of creating mental maps, expressing mental maps, changing it up, and just offering an alternative cognition process to coding.
Yeah, it's so true. Listen, I've been greedy hogging the questions, so I want to make sure we get some in from the audience. I'm having to lean in because I don't have my reading glasses. Stephen Browning, hello, Stephen, has asked, as regards image recognition, we were told on previous CogX events that our conscious brain hallucinates when we are about to see, and then we correct when it appears. Artificial image recognition can't do this. Okay. Does that mean, is that a question or a statement?
Well, listen, I don't have the question. I'll simply say, first of all, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychologist. So my comments come from a position of some ignorance here, but I'll say two things. Firstly, there's, as everyone in the AI community knows, we are only really still grappling to understand how our brains and minds process information and external stimuli. And it may not be as logical and rational as everyone wants, not logical, rational, wrong word, as one-dimensional, as unidirectional people think. That's point one. Point two is a very important note of caution I would also put into any discussion about this is to read Joseph Heinrich's brilliant book, which came out early this year, about the nature of being weird. Western educated individuals, rich and democratic. Briefly, what he argues is that the way that weird Western people process information today is an extreme anomaly by the standards of most societies in most times, in most parts of the world in human history. Because in a nutshell, the very act of living with reading and a unidirectional process of assembling information and expressing ideas, which is the Roman alphabet, creates a linear sequential pattern of thought and also tends to lead to tunnel vision. And he contrasts that to non-literate societies where there's much more of a tendency to have quick snapshots holistically of an entire pattern and an entire picture and look for patterns rather than just screening out and honing down. I would argue actually that second mode of thought is also found in pictorial writing systems like Japanese, which I studied. So anyone who's grown up in a culture where you look at characters, I think has a slightly different mental process sometimes as well. But the point he makes very strongly is that psychology as a discipline has done amazing stuff, but almost all of its research subjects have been on the material closest to hand, which was Western highly educated students, because they're the ones at universities. So what psychology has found may not be universal to all cultures and societies, and it's worth thinking about that. And that same may be true for issues about cognition and image recognition as well, when it comes to the point that has just been made.
Yeah, or even emotion detection, that sort of very questionable science, and AI is obviously running after that one. Is there a universal set of human emotions?
Well, the issue about facial recognition is very important in that respect. It really is. And I don't think it's going to be an easy answer to that. And that's, again, one reason why some cultural appreciation is important, the context, and checks and balances again.
And Stephen has asked a second question that I want to just make sure we can pop this in, squeeze it under the time. Do different population groups exhibit different approaches to recognition? So maybe my identity.
Recognition, I don't know so much, but I say I would go back to Joseph Heinrich's work and say that absolutely in his work, he compares a group called the Mapuche in Chile with a group with basically Western educated students and how they respond to pictures and what they focus in on, what they see. And it's a very good metaphor because they just use different logic and reasoning when asked questions, but they also appear, he argues, and he's actually trained as a physical anthropologist, which is more about the biological side of things rather than cultural anthropologist. He argues that in fact there are different responses in terms of the brain and eye movement when faced with pictures, because they're not trained to do what anyone trained in the Roman alphabet is trained to do, or coding, I should say, which is to think in a one-directional sequential manner. They look at an entire snapshot, holistic snapshot, and move back and forth in terms of their processing and reasoning.
That's fascinating. Listen, this entire book is fascinating. I haven't enjoyed a weekend of reading as much as I did this one.
Thank you.
So I fully recommend it. And I genuinely think it will help all sorts of people who make that ridiculous assumption that this is a soft skill or a soft science. It's anything but. It's a complementary science to the more empirical sciences. And thank you so much for writing it. I think we're all going to benefit.
Thank you. And by the way, if anyone from the AI community wants to get in touch with me and answer my questions about jokes, I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Gillian, for those incredible insights. And Gillian, your story is absolutely fascinating. As an economist who moved into public policy, I think definitely taking different views on subjects really does bring a new angle to it. And I was really intrigued, actually, because this linked back to one of the sessions we had earlier this morning really beautifully with Polly Mackenzie and Heaton Shah from the British Academy, where they talked about the importance of social science for ensuring the impact of scientific and technological progress. But I think what this really underlined for me is how important it is for those who are developing technology, particularly AI, to take some time out to understand other people, think about what it means to be human. And this idea of anthro-intelligence that you discussed seems like a really important tool that can provide intellectual checks and balances on technology. I think you raised some pretty tricky questions for anthropology as a discipline too, in terms of how anthropologists work with government and industry. And I certainly will be picking up a copy of this book after this session, and I do recommend others to do that as well. So I think with that, that's going to be it from me here on the economy stage today. But we do have one more event for all of you, which you should stay tuned for. So at 5 p.m, David Matten, the author of New World, Same Humans, will be talking to FT columnist Joy DeLuco about how AI will unlock new ways to serve fundamental needs. So don't go away. Join us at 5 p.m. for that session. And don't forget, you can tweet us via CogX_festival or use the hashtag CogX2021 to continue the conversation. Enjoy.